January 17, 1945. Camp Blanding, Florida. The winter sun pressed warmth into the sandy soil of northern Florida, and the air carried the scent of pine and distant swampland. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Blanding, a German prisoner of war stood motionless before a wooden table, his hands trembling not from cold, but from disbelief. Before him lay a cardboard box stamped with the Red Cross insignia, its contents spilling forth in an array he had not seen in years. Chocolate bars wrapped in wax paper, tins of condensed milk, packages of cigarettes, hard candies in bright cellophane, bars of white soap that smelled of nothing but cleanliness itself. The prisoner, a former Wehrmacht corporal named Heinrich Müller, captured 3 months earlier in the Ardennes, stared at the pile as though it were a mirage. Behind him, 24 men in faded gray uniforms stood in silent rows, each waiting his turn. None spoke. The only sound was the rustle of paper and the distant call of mockingbirds in the longleaf pines. This was not the America they had been taught to fear. This was not the enemy described in the speeches of Goebbels or the dire warnings whispered in foxholes across Normandy. This was something far more unsettling: abundance, generosity, a kind of wealth so vast it could be given away to enemies without thought. And in that moment, standing in the Florida heat with a box of goods his own family in Hamburg had not seen in 2 years, Müller felt the first crack in the edifice of everything he had been told. The story of German prisoners of war in American custody during World War II is one of paradox and profound psychological transformation. Between 1943 and 1946, over 370,000 German soldiers were held in more than 500 camps scattered across the continental United States, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Iowa, from the forests of Maine to the cotton fields of Texas. These men arrived expecting brutality. They had been conditioned by years of National Socialist propaganda to believe that capture by the Western Allies, and especially by the Americans, would mean starvation, forced labor, perhaps execution. The propaganda ministry had painted the United States as a nation of mongrel races, decadent and cruel, controlled by Jewish financiers and corrupt politicians. German soldiers were told that American camps would mirror the harshness they themselves had inflicted upon Soviet prisoners: deprivation, disease, death. What they encountered instead was something their ideology had no framework to explain: a nation so wealthy it could feed its enemies better than the Third Reich fed its own citizens. A society organized not by racial purity and militaristic discipline, but by voluntary cooperation, rule of law, and an almost incomprehensible material prosperity. The shock of this encounter would shake many of these men to their core, planting seeds of doubt that would grow in the silence of captivity and bloom in the ruins of post-war Germany. To understand the magnitude of this shock, one must first understand the conditions from which these men came. By 1944, the German home front was collapsing under the weight of total war. Food rations had been cut repeatedly. Bread was adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. Meat was a memory. The standard ration for a civilian in Berlin by the winter of 1944 provided fewer than 1,500 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, far below what was needed for physical labor. Soldiers at the front fared little better. Wehrmacht rations, once adequate, had deteriorated steadily as supply lines stretched and fractured. The vaunted 1,000-year Reich could no longer feed its armies. Coffee was replaced by roasted acorns. Butter vanished. Chocolate became a luxury reserved for propaganda purposes, handed out in tiny portions to boost morale before hopeless offensives. German soldiers marching through France in 1944 were often sustained by what they could loot from the countryside, a grim reversal of the triumphant campaigns of 1940. Hunger had become a constant companion. Many prisoners arriving in American camps had not eaten a full meal in weeks. Some had subsisted on nothing but stale black bread and thin soup for months. They arrived gaunt, hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging loose on frames wasted by malnutrition and the relentless grind of combat. They expected nothing better in captivity. They braced for starvation. Instead, they were fed, not just adequately, but generously. The Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners of war be given rations equivalent to those of the captor nation's garrison troops, and the United States adhered to this standard with a literalism that bordered on the absurd by wartime standards. German POWs in American camps received approximately 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day, more than most American civilians, more than British soldiers, vastly more than the rations allotted to German civilians or soldiers. Breakfast might include oatmeal or cornflakes, fried eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with real sugar and canned milk. Lunch brought meat stews, mashed potatoes, canned vegetables, bread, sometimes pie or cake. Dinner was similar: roast chicken or pork chops, beans, rice, salad, dessert. The meals were plain by the standards of American abundance, cafeteria-style institutional fare, but to men who had grown accustomed to knowing hunger, they were feasts. Witnesses described prisoners weeping at their first meal. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or a trap. Others ate until they vomited, their shrunken stomachs unable to process the sudden influx of fats and proteins. Within weeks, the transformation was visible. Hollow cheeks filled out, ribs disappeared beneath healthy flesh, eyes regained their brightness. The prisoners were recovering their bodies. What took longer to recover was their understanding of the world. But the food itself was only the beginning. What truly shattered the mental defenses of many prisoners was the arrival of the Red Cross parcels. These packages, standardized boxes weighing approximately 11 pounds, were distributed by the International Committee of the Red Cross to prisoners of war in camps across the globe. The contents varied slightly by availability and destination, but a typical parcel might contain 1 pound of canned meat, 8 ounces of canned fish, 1 pound of cheese, 4 ounces of butter or margarine, a pound of sugar, 8 ounces of chocolate, instant coffee, tea, powdered milk, biscuits or crackers, a bar of soap, cigarettes, salt, pepper, and occasionally small luxuries like condensed milk, jam, or hard candy. For German prisoners in American camps, these parcels arrived with stunning regularity, sometimes weekly, often supplementing rations that were already generous. The psychological impact was immense. Here were items that German civilians had not seen in years, goods that even high-ranking Nazi officials struggled to obtain, now freely distributed to enemy soldiers held behind wire. The chocolate alone was a revelation. American chocolate, mass-produced by Hershey and Mars, bore little resemblance to the European product. It was sweeter, smoother, designed for a market that demanded consistency and abundance. To a German soldier who had not tasted chocolate since before Stalingrad, it was ambrosia. The cigarettes were equally symbolic. American tobacco, Virginia and Carolina leaf, rolled in endless quantities, distributed not as precious commodities but as casual comforts. Prisoners smoked with a freedom they had not known since the war began, trading cigarettes for favors, stockpiling them, marveling at the casual waste. Yet the cruelest irony lay not in what the prisoners received, but in what they knew their families would never see. The Red Cross system, in theory, was reciprocal. Packages were supposed to flow to prisoners on all sides, but the reality was brutally asymmetric. Allied prisoners in German camps did receive Red Cross parcels, but distribution was sporadic, hampered by Germany's collapsing infrastructure and, in many cases, by deliberate obstruction. By late 1944, rail lines were shattered, trucks lacked fuel, and the German bureaucracy, never efficient at the best of times, was crumbling under Allied bombing and administrative chaos. Packages piled up in warehouses, spoiled, were pilfered by guards or desperate civilians. Many Allied prisoners survived only because of these parcels. German rations for POWs were often below starvation level. But German civilians and prisoners in Soviet hands received nothing. The Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention and showed no interest in humanitarian niceties. German prisoners in Soviet camps died by the hundreds of thousands from starvation, exposure, and disease. And German civilians on the home front, particularly after the war's end, faced deprivation that bordered on famine. The bitter winter of 1945–46 would see mass starvation in the ruins of German cities. Yet here, in the warm sunshine of Florida or Texas or Kansas, German prisoners opened boxes of abundance and thought of their mothers, their wives, their children, who were eating sawdust bread and rutabaga soup, if they were eating at all. The guilt was crushing. The cognitive dissonance was worse. Heinrich Müller, the corporal from Hamburg, wrote a letter home in February 1945, smuggled through the Red Cross censorship by the simple expedient of saying nothing that could be construed as military intelligence. He wrote about the food. He described in careful detail the meals he ate, the contents of the parcels, the sheer volume of goods that flowed into the camp. He wrote about the chocolate and how he had saved a bar to send home, only to be told that such packages were not permitted. He wrote about the soap, real soap that lathered, not the gritty ersatz cakes that smelled of chemicals. He wrote about the apples, fresh apples from Washington State, handed out as snacks. And then in the final paragraph, he wrote something that would be echoed in thousands of similar letters from camps across America. I do not understand this country. We are enemies. We bombed their friends. We would have destroyed them if we could. And yet they feed us like guests. What kind of people are these? The letter reached Hamburg in April, forwarded through neutral Switzerland. His mother read it in the cellar of their bombed-out apartment building, by candlelight, while sirens wailed overhead. She wept, not from joy, but from a grief so deep it had no name. Her son was safe and well-fed while she starved. The world had turned inside out. This was the psychological weapon that no strategist had planned, no general had ordered, but which proved more effective than any bomb or bullet in breaking the ideological grip of National Socialism. The prisoners were not mistreated. They were not tortured or starved or worked to death. They were simply shown, by example, the fundamental lie at the heart of their former world. They had been told that the democracies were weak, that free societies were decadent and doomed, that only through iron discipline and racial purity could a nation achieve greatness. They had been told that America was a nation of soft, mongrel peoples, corrupted by materialism and Jewish influence, incapable of sacrifice or true strength. And now they stood in the physical manifestation of American power, not in the form of tanks or bombers, but in the simple, overwhelming reality of surplus. Food in quantities that defied imagination. Factories that could produce chocolate bars by the millions while simultaneously building the armada that crushed the Wehrmacht. A society so rich that it could afford to be generous to its enemies, not out of weakness, but out of a strength so vast it had no need for cruelty. The camps themselves reinforced this lesson. German prisoners were housed in barracks that, while Spartan, were clean, heated in winter and weatherproof. They slept on cots with mattresses and blankets. They had access to showers with hot water and soap. They received medical care from trained doctors and dentists, care that often exceeded what German soldiers had received in their own military. Dental work, a luxury on the home front, was routine in the camps. Prisoners had broken teeth filled, infected gums treated, eyeglasses prescribed and fitted. They played football and volleyball in the recreation yards. They formed orchestras and theater groups. They read books from camp libraries that included not just approved texts, but American magazines, newspapers, even translations of forbidden works. Some camps offered educational courses. Prisoners learned English, studied agriculture or engineering, attended lectures on American history and civics. This was not part of any formal re-education program that would come later, but rather the organic expression of American assumptions about what constituted humane treatment. And it baffled the prisoners. They had been prepared for many things, but not for kindness. At Camp Camo, Mississippi, a prisoner named Otto Becker, a former schoolteacher conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1943, described his experience in a diary that would later be preserved in the Library of Congress. He wrote of his arrival at the camp in July 1944, freshly captured after the fall of Cherbourg. He had expected brutality. He had hidden a small cyanide capsule in the lining of his boot, a final escape if torture became unbearable. Instead, he was deloused, given clean clothing, examined. Yet not all prisoners were so easily convinced. Many arrived as committed Nazis, true believers in the Führer and the righteousness of the German cause. For these men, the generosity was not enlightening but confusing, even threatening. They clung to their ideology with the desperation of drowning men clutching debris. They formed cliques within the camps, enforced Nazi discipline, held secret courts to punish those who cooperated too readily with the Americans or expressed doubts about the regime. There were beatings. There were murders. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943, a prisoner named Johannes Kunz was beaten to death by fellow POWs for the crime of informing camp authorities about escape plans, and more damningly, for expressing pro-American sentiments. His body was found hanged in a shower room, staged to look like suicide. 5 prisoners were eventually tried, convicted, and executed for the murder. Such incidents were not common, but they revealed the deep fractures within the prisoner population. The war raged on not just in Europe but within the wire, a conflict of ideas, a struggle for the souls of men who had once marched in lockstep but now faced the unbearable question: what if we were wrong? The American authorities, for their part, were initially indifferent to these ideological battles. The camps were run by the army, often with minimal staff, supervised by officers who had no training in handling enemy prisoners and little interest in their political rehabilitation. The primary goals were security and compliance with the Geneva Convention. Anything beyond that was incidental. But as the war dragged on and the prisoner population swelled, the authorities began to recognize the opportunity. These men would return to Germany someday. What they thought, what they believed would matter in the reconstruction. Quietly, almost hesitantly, programs began. Newspapers were introduced: Der Ruf, The Call, a German-language publication produced by anti-Nazi prisoners under American supervision, which presented news of the war, essays on democracy, critiques of the Hitler regime. Films were shown, documentaries about American life, newsreels of the Nazi death camps discovered by Allied troops. The impact was uneven. Some prisoners dismissed the footage as propaganda, faked by Hollywood. Others watched in silent horror, confronted by images of Buchenwald and Dachau, and felt the final collapse of belief. "We did not know," became the common refrain. And while historians would later argue about the sincerity of that claim, in the camps it was spoken with genuine anguish by many who had convinced themselves that the rumors were exaggerations, that their sacrifices served a just cause, that the suffering would lead to something glorious. The films showed them the truth. There was no glory, there was only ash, but it was still the food that did the deepest work. Food was not abstract. Food did not require literacy or political sophistication to understand. Food was immediate, visceral, undeniable. Every meal was a sermon. Every Red Cross parcel was a parable. And slowly, through the repetition of abundance, the message sank in. This was what a free society could produce. This was the fruit of democracy, of industrial capitalism, of voluntary cooperation among free men. Not perfection. The prisoners were keenly aware of America's contradictions, its racial segregation, its poverty, the gap between its ideals and its practice. but a system that, despite its flaws, generated such surplus that it could afford to feed its enemies. The contrast with the Third Reich was inescapable. Germany had promised greatness and delivered ruin. America made no grand promises but delivered meals. Corporal Mueller, that prisoner who stood trembling before his first Red Cross parcel in January 1945, would spend the next 18 months in Camp Blanding. He worked in the camp's bakery, learning to make American-style bread, soft and white, so different from the dense rye loaves of home. He played in a camp football team. He attended English lessons. He read books. And every week, the parcels arrived. And every week he felt the same stab of guilt and wonder. In his diary, recovered decades later and donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum by his daughter, he wrote in March 1946, "I am going home soon. The war is over. Germany is defeated, occupied, starving. I am well fed and healthy, better than I have been in years. I do not know what I will find when I return. I do not know if my family still lives. But I know this, I will never again believe that might makes right or that cruelty is strength. I have seen what real strength looks like. It looks like a box of chocolates given to an enemy. It looks like mercy when vengeance would be easier. The Americans defeated us not because they hated better, but because they built better, because they could afford to be kind. I do not know if I can forgive myself for what I was part of. But I know I will never forget what I have learned here." The statistical record bears out the individual testimonies. Post-war surveys of German POWs who had been held in American camps showed a significant shift in political attitudes. A majority expressed favorable views of the United States and support for democratic governance. Many would go on to play roles in the reconstruction of West Germany, bringing with them a pragmatic appreciation for American-style institutions. The economic miracle of the Bundesrepublik, the rapid transformation of West Germany into a prosperous, stable democracy, owed much to the Marshall Plan and American aid. But it also owed something to the psychological groundwork laid in those camps, to the hundreds of thousands of men who had seen with their own eyes that democracy worked, that it produced not just freedom but wealth, not just rights but bread. They became the foot soldiers of Reconstruction, the voters and workers and small businessmen who chose the Western model not out of ideological conviction, but out of practical memory. They had been fed by that system, and the system that had starved them was dead. Yet the symbolism of the Red Cross parcel resonated beyond its immediate recipients. In the ruined cities of Germany, in the displaced persons' camps, in the whispered conversations of a shattered nation, stories circulated. Stories of prisoners who had eaten better than their captors, of chocolate and cigarettes and soap flowing freely in American camps while German children starved. The stories bred resentment in some. How could the enemy be so generous to soldiers while German civilians suffered? But in others, they sparked a different realization. The Americans had been strong enough to win and merciful enough to spare. This was not the behavior of the decadent, mongrel weaklings described by Goebbels. This was the behavior of victors secure in their strength, a people who did not need to crush every enemy to feel safe. And perhaps, some began to think, if that was the price of freedom and prosperity, if that was what a democratic society looked like, then perhaps it was worth learning from. The parcels themselves became objects of legend. Prisoners who returned home in 1946 and 1947 brought with them stories of the boxes, of the abundance, of the impossible generosity. Some brought physical evidence. A saved chocolate bar, carefully wrapped and carried across the ocean. A pack of cigarettes preserved as a talisman. A bar of soap, too precious to use, kept as proof that such things existed. These objects circulated like relics, passed from hand to hand, tangible evidence of a world beyond the ruins. Children who had never tasted chocolate stared in wonder at the wrappers. Women who had not smelled real soap in years held the bars to their faces and wept. And slowly the mythology grew. America, the land of plenty. America, where even prisoners lived like kings. The propaganda of abundance, more powerful than any official campaign, spread by word of mouth, by the testimony of men who had been enemies and were now witnesses. The irony, of course, was that this generosity was never calculated as psychological warfare. It was not a strategy devised by clever intelligence officers or propagandists. It was simply the application of existing legal obligations under the Geneva Convention, carried out with the efficiency and surplus capacity that characterized American logistics. The United States could afford to feed its prisoners generously, because it could afford to feed everyone generously. The same industrial machine that produced 30,000 aircraft in 1944 could produce chocolate bars by the billions. The same agricultural system that fed a nation of 140 million could easily extend meals to a few 100,000 prisoners. There was no sacrifice involved, no great moral deliberation. It was, in the American context, simply the obvious thing to do. And that very lack of deliberation, that casual ease with which the system operated, was perhaps the most devastating revelation for the prisoners. They had fought for a regime that demanded total sacrifice, that extracted every ounce of strength from its people, that glorified suffering and hardship as virtues. And they had lost to a nation that took abundance for granted, that wasted food, that gave away surplus without a second thought. The ideological implications were crushing. As the months passed and the war ground to its conclusion, the flow of parcels continued unabated. Even after VE Day, even as millions of German civilians faced the starvation winter of 1945-46, the Red Cross packages still arrived at the American camps. Prisoners who should have been repatriated but were kept for labor details. Prisoners who worked on American farms or in canning factories under contract labor programs continued to receive their weekly boxes. The contrast was now openly acknowledged. Prisoners working on farms in Iowa or Wisconsin or California lived better. The epilogue to this story unfolds across decades. Heinrich Müller returned to Hamburg in October 1946. He found his mother alive, barely, living in a single room of a bombed-out building. His father had died in the firebombing of 1943. His sister had fled east and disappeared. The city was rubble, patrolled by British soldiers, its population gaunt and hollow-eyed. Müller weighed 60 pounds more than any of his neighbors. He brought with him 2 chocolate bars, saved from his final Red Cross parcel, and a bar of soap. He gave them to his mother. She held the chocolate in her hands, turning it over and over, and then carefully divided 1 bar into 20 pieces, rationing it out over the next month, 1 small square each evening, letting it dissolve slowly on her tongue. She never ate the second bar. She kept it in a drawer until her death in 1963, wrapped in paper, a relic of a time when the world made no sense. Müller himself went to work for the British occupation authorities, then for the American High Commission, then for a German-American trading company. He learned English fluently. He visited the United States 3 times in his life, and until his death in 1989, he kept in his wallet a small photograph. Himself, young and gaunt in a Wehrmacht uniform, standing in front of the barbed wire of Camp Blanding, holding a Red Cross parcel. On the back, in faded ink, he had written, "The day I stopped believing lies." The broader impact is harder to quantify, but no less real. The prisoner of war camps in America served as an accidental laboratory of ideological transformation. They demonstrated, to hundreds of thousands of witnesses, the material and moral superiority of a system that the prisoners had been taught to despise. This was not soft power in the modern sense. There were no consultants, no focus groups, no strategic communications plans. It was simply the effect of reality colliding with propaganda. The prisoners had been told one story about America, about democracy, about the inevitable triumph of totalitarian discipline over bourgeois decadence. And then they lived the contradiction. They ate the evidence. and many of them could not ignore what they had experienced. In the decades that followed, when historians and sociologists studied the successful integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance, they pointed to many factors: the Marshall Plan, the Cold War imperatives, the leadership of Adenauer, the absence of a vengeful Versailles-style peace. But woven through all of these was the less tangible legacy of the POW experience. The men who had been prisoners, who had been fed and treated fairly, who had returned home with stories of American abundance and generosity, formed a constituency predisposed to Western alignment. They were not starry-eyed idealists. Many remained skeptical, cynical, hardened by war, but they were pragmatists. They had seen what worked. And when the choice came between aligning with the Soviet model, with its promises of revolutionary justice and its reality of privation, or aligning with the American model, with its chaotic freedom and its undeniable prosperity, the choice was not difficult. They chose the side that had fed them. The symbolism of the Red Cross parcel, that small cardboard box, echoes through the post-war order. It represents a truth that totalitarians have always struggled to understand. That abundance is not a sign of decadence but of strength. That generosity is not weakness but confidence. That a society which can afford to be kind to its enemies has already won the only victories that matter. The prisoners received chocolate and soap and cigarettes, but what they really received was an education in the possibilities of freedom. They learned that democracy was not just an abstract ideal, but a system that delivered tangible benefits. That capitalism was not merely exploitation, but a mechanism for generating surplus. That pluralism and tolerance were not fatal weaknesses, but sources of resilience and creativity. These were lessons that no amount of propaganda could have taught, no speech or pamphlet could have conveyed. They had to be lived, experienced, eaten. And so the story ends not with a dramatic moment but with a slow, pervasive transformation. In the warmth of a Florida camp, a German soldier holds a chocolate bar and feels the world shift beneath his feet. In a ruined city, a mother saves a piece of American chocolate for 20 years, a sacred object from a time when enemies were kinder than friends. In a rebuilt nation, a former prisoner becomes a shopkeeper, a teacher, a mayor, carrying with him the memory of meals freely given and the knowledge that the system which had fed him might be worth preserving. The Red Cross parcels were small things, insignificant in the vast machinery of war, but they carried a weight beyond their contents. They were proof that another world was possible, that cruelty was not inevitable, that prosperity could be shared. And for men who had known only hunger and hardship under a regime that promised greatness, that proof was revolutionary. The food was never just food. It was a message, delivered 3 times a day, repeated in every parcel, reinforced by every bar of soap and every cigarette. This is what freedom produces. This is what democracy looks like. This is the dividend of a system that values human dignity, that builds institutions of law rather than leaders of men, that trusts in cooperation rather than domination. The prisoners of war, standing in their camps across America, surrounded by abundance they had never known and would struggle to recreate, learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible. They learned it with their bodies, with their returning health, with the simple satisfaction of a full stomach. And many of them carried that lesson home, into the ruins, into the reconstruction, into the long work of building a different Germany. The chocolate melted, the cigarettes were smoked, the soap was used and gone. But the memory remained, stubborn and indelible, a small seed of doubt planted in the fertile soil of defeat, which would grow into something unexpected. Gratitude, and with it, the first tentative steps toward reconciliation. In the end, the most profound victory was not military but moral. It was won not on battlefields but in mess halls, not with bullets but with bread. The German prisoners of war who returned home from America brought with them a story that their former masters could never have allowed them to tell. The story of an enemy who had won with such overwhelming superiority that it could afford to be generous, who had so much that it could give to those who had tried to destroy it, who embodied a strength so complete that it required no cruelty to prove itself. That story, told and retold in 1,000 variations, whispered in cellars and shouted in beer halls, became one of the founding myths of the new Germany, a parable of American power and European reconstruction.